While it's critical to save our reef ecosystems, there's still no single definition on what a restored reef should look like. At Iberostar, 10 kilometers of reef protect our properties. We know they're in decline. That's why we believe reef protection and restoration must play a role to ensure these reefs improve in health alongside our tourism operations. Let's explore what it means when we say restoring or rebuilding reefs. My name is Dr. Megan Morikawa, and I'm the Global Director of Sustainability at Iberostar Group. We've got a great set of panelists here to explore a little bit on what it means when we're talking about restoring coral reefs. It's my pleasure to introduce Lisa Karn, who's the Executive Director at Fragments of Hope. We also have Dr. Maya Trotz, Board Member at Fragments of Hope. We've got Tom Moore, Coral Restoration Program Manager at NOAA. And we have Dr. Joanna Kaye, our Regional Science Coordinator for Wave of Change Movement at Iberostar. At Iberostar, we have talked a lot about coral reef restoration, helping us to protect our coastlines from storm damage, which might mean being able to take a lot of wave energy to help us to restore fish biomass, if that's even possible, for food security purposes and to kind of increase biodiversity. Lisa, I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit, given our discussion about historical baselines, it looking different around the world, if we have a sense on how coral reef restoration might look different or have different destinations given the goals that we might be working towards.
At Fragments of Hope in Belize, we've always focused in very shallow reefs, and there's also been recent studies to indicate that it's the top meter of the reef that does provide the best shoreline protection, breaking up over 80% of high energy. So obviously, if you're restoring for shoreline protection, you wouldn't necessarily want to be planting stuff at 12 meters, 18 meters. You want to be focused on the top shallow reefs and the species that live there. If you're restoring for fisheries habitat, that would be something, again, different. Ideally, for us in Belize, we're trying to meet all of those goals with our shallow areas, but there has been concerns brought up from the dive industry that we're not doing enough for the deeper dive sites that they're seeing being sort of ravaged by bleaching, disease events, and other factors. So we've been focused in the shallow areas all these whiles, but there is a cry for deeper site restoration as well.
We're thrilled to talk with you guys at Fragments of Hope because I think it's pretty clear that the efforts that you guys have succeeded in are some of the most successful stories of being able to grow coral at very large scales relative to a lot of initiatives around the world. Maya, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit on what some of the barriers have been for reaching some of those goals and some of the barriers that maybe you're seeing into the future to being able to scale this even further.
For sure. In terms of the work, I'm most familiar with the work in Belize and the Caribbean region. And I would say funding, major challenge, visibility, unchecked development, local investment in capacity building are major barriers for coral restoration.
Tom, I'm sure that your perspectives as well in coordinating efforts at NOAA have given you a sense of some other barriers. Do you want to tell us a little bit on what some of those have been as well?
As Maya said, we have to address the funding issue, but we're not going to be able to fund our way alone out of this problem. Even with 10 times more funding, we have a lot more than 10 times the amount of restoration that we need to execute, right? So what we need to do is we need to figure out how we can work at a much greater scale, be much more efficient at the same time while we increase funding. So, if we can increase funding by 3 to 5 times, and we can increase efficiency by 3 to 5 times as well, all of a sudden you start having kind of more exponential change in terms of the amount of restoration that can be executed. And so I also like to think about us scaling up at multiple different time periods, right? I like to think about 3 different time periods in terms of what scaling up coral reef restoration looks like. And it depends on where you're at in different points of the world too. One is what can we do faster tomorrow, next week, next month, right? When Lisa is out doing an amazing job planting corals, I'm sure always going through her head and her team's head is, how can we work a little faster? How can we carry a few more corals today? How can we get 20% more than we got yesterday down, right? That's what we have to be, one sense of where we have to be focused on. And many of those are kind of small issues. And then there's the medium-term issues, the ones of how do we increase scope over the next 2 years? I look at those as how do we carry more corals, how do we grow more corals, and how simply do we just attach those corals to the reef. The actual attachment of the corals to the reef can be one of the slowest processes that we have in this whole thing. So we're spending a lot of time and investment actually at NOAA trying to come up with that perfect underwater super glue that will allow us to just literally touch that coral to the reef, glue it, and walk away from it. We can't do that right now the same way you can glue something to your wall at home. And so that's kind of the medium term in terms of how we can scale things up. And then longer term, we have to incorporate more automation and efficiency and robotics potentially into the process, right? How do we get the divers to be a supplement to coral reef restoration, but not the impediment? Divers can only be underwater, even a good diver, 4 hours a day, probably, maybe more in some places. But even then, you're lucky if you can get out half the days in a year. How can we make those 4 hours a day the most efficient 4 hours possible? How can we augment that 4 hours with other automation along the way? This isn't going to be things that we have online within the next 2 years or 3 years, but we need to start making investments now so we can have more of that automation, more of those robotics, potentially even artificial intelligence, helping those divers out when we're 5 to 7 years down the road so we can get to that 10, 20 times increase in scale.
But I also think we need to look at organizations that have done restoration in places and have success stories and what they need for funding. So it's to support more local livelihoods, so more funding for jobs. It's to support full-time staff, which some don't have. And so it's different scales. And I don't think we should, like, I don't want to push the technology as the be all end all when we've seen sort of this amazing benefit from having local people actually be involved a lot more with the work. And can we scale that also, especially in times when, you see the tourism sort of deplete? So can they still do the restoration work because it's good for the climate, it's good for fisheries? And for us here in Florida, we like that lobster comes from Belize. And if you have more reef habitat, we'll probably get more lobster.
I think this is a great demonstration that there's a number of barriers at a number of various scales that we're going to need to overcome, including some understanding of standardizations across both where it is that we would like to go and the ways in which we would like to get there. One of the things that happened in the last year was the IPCC report on ocean and the cryosphere came out, and it helped us to line up around this figure that even if we curbed global climate change to be around 1.5 degrees of warming by 2050, we could still expect to lose 90% of reefs globally. And I think all of this, in addition to some of these barriers, makes it hard to understand how it is that we can balance doing everything all at once. And so, Tom, I'm wondering if you could start us off on a little bit of a weedy question of how do we balance investing in restoration while also trying to work towards some of these other goals and stressors you guys have mentioned, like bettering water quality or curbing climate change? How do we prioritize which initiatives that we take?
Yeah. This is always the tough answer or the tough question here, because the answer is really we need to do it all, right? They are all necessary and none of them by themselves are sufficient. And we have to recognize too that we are in a conundrum with coral reefs, that we also have to work on doing restoration even when we haven't fixed all these other problems yet. The reality is if we wait to do coral reef restoration and start recovering these systems until either we've addressed all of these local, regional, and global threats, we're not going to have any corals left to do restoration with. We have to start now, recognizing we're still going to lose some along the way, and cross our fingers and continue to message to our other partners out there how important it is to deal with those other threats as well. They are all necessary. None of the solutions by themselves are sufficient to solving the problem.
What we're hoping is that if tourism understands the ability to adopt restoration is part of its normal, for being able to maintain its properties, to extend the care of those properties to the ecosystems and the nature that is surrounding and providing services to that tourism. How can that help to scale and just start new initiatives in new sorts of locations? But as Tom says as well, you can't just do that. You kind of need to do a little bit of everything all at once. And fortunately, a lot of tourism has started to align around some common goals, whether it be to see a way for the entire sector to be carbon neutral by 2050. At Iberostar, we're working towards becoming carbon neutral, if not carbon net positive, by 2030, by not only reducing our energy and switching to renewables in places where that is a very slow thing to happen, understandably, but also looking at ways that we can use blue carbon and these incredible coastal, not only marine, but terrestrial communities as ways to protect and curate destinations at that sort of scale. I think this is a great time for tourism to reflect, particularly as it has been so affected by the global pandemic around the world, on whether or not, in order to remain resilient for crises that we know are to come, in a weakened system because of all of the financial damage that has been happening to the sector, if we can figure out a way to just start working on these problems and to start working on these initiatives all at once. And this is actually leading to my next question, which is to just start, I think, requires knowing a little bit about what has worked. Right? And we have here a group of people who have some incredible success stories from your locations and your initiatives. We'd love to hear a little bit about what it took for you guys to be able to get there, hear about those success stories, and also to hear if you have any other bright spots to share that you've seen across your colleagues. I would imagine that it is possible and that we're seeing that this is working in some locations. And Maya, maybe you can start us off with some of the success stories that you guys have had at Fragments of Hope.
A major success story I think I see coming from Fragments of Hope is this idea of their work becoming sort of a convergence space that is bringing lots of people together to talk about other challenges. Not just researchers trying to quantify or study the reef restoration work, but it's bringing together engineers who are looking at, how do you actually deal with water quality from the toilets that are close to the quays where they're doing the restoration work. And to me, as an engineer who studies wastewater and looking at how do we clean up everything that we flush down the toilet, it wasn't really until you go under the water, and most engineers don't get under the water to see a reef, that you're like, this is what we're trying to protect, right? This is what our standards are supposed to look like to protect this environment. For the tourism industry right now, people are talking about, food security. So how does that integrate into the infrastructure that you have close to the coast? And not just the fish that will come when the reefs are restored, but land-based activity that could be more, to help with that circular economy that also reduces any waste or so on that could get into the marine environment.
I think that is a great example. I also really much appreciate that you're bringing the concept of circular economy for us at Iberostar as well. This is a really important way for us to say, the first place we have to start is in our facilities. And this is why we also have a goal to be waste-free by 2025 as part of our movement towards circular economy. But that must extend past just the facilities themselves and look into the reefs and look to the great stories of all of you who have worked for years in creating these success stories for our ability to then say, okay, how do we take our best understanding of some of the standardizations that you guys are setting out, learnings from that, and implement them in programs that we can sustain across scale, that we hope to engage other tourism partners so that they can do the same in this greater context. And speaking about this greater context, I think is what I'm going to ask Joanna here. Joanna, can you tell us a little bit on what role does reef restoration play in the larger picture of restoration across other coastal ecosystems, like the mangroves or the wetlands or the seagrasses that are also an important part of these coastal communities?
We know that the connectivity is important, and we know that there are some studies that mention leaf corals, seagrasses, and mangroves supply more protection services than any individual habitat, any combination of two habitats. So design of nature-based coastal protection schemes also require quantifying and understanding the interaction of the hydrodynamic connectivity between biotic and abiotic features that characterize a marine seascape.
We know that all of these ecosystems are interconnected, and therefore this is why we want to not only take a look at our ability to do reef restoration, but also protection and restoration and other ecosystems that surround these sorts of regions, part of a holistic look at coastal health. But to bring it back down to coral reefs again, Lisa, maybe you could finish us off by telling us a little bit from your work and experience and seeing this work, seeing this fail. Do you think it is possible to restore critical coral reefs at scale? Is this something that humanity can do together, or are we kind of chasing a target that keeps eluding us?
Oh, you left me with that question, huh? So again, most people don't talk beyond a hectare. That's as big as we've really thought about so far. And we know we were just able to quantify that. In fact, we have replenished over 20% live coral cover of a hectare of shallow fringing reef at Laughing Bird. It's one of the challenges when we first began here over 10 years ago, is that everybody said you can never get it back to how it was, quote unquote, back to, referring to pre-80s, pre-white band disease for the acroporids. And one of the slides I always show is that at Laughing Bird Key National Park, we actually have restored the shallow reef to over 50%. And it does look, how it used to, but as Tom rightly said, you can't do that everywhere. There's no way we could do that everywhere. And that's why I wanted to emphasize the site selection criteria and standardizing that. That's so crucial, because otherwise you're wasting time and energy if you're trying to restore willy-nilly without, really thinking about, the long-term benefits. Hopefully we can prioritize as groups, what is it, like if we just wanted to focus on a species at a time or a region at a time, I think if we collaborated more and came up with this, we could actually make some legitimate progress.
I am a firm believer that we can do this. We can succeed at scale. What we have to do, though, is not try to get scared of the big problem, right? If you zoom out and you look at all the reefs in the world, or even all the reefs in a particular region, it can become very daunting to think about how you would achieve restoration across those. That's not the right way to do it. The right way to do it is to go within a region, as Lisa was saying, start thinking smartly about site selection and starting to bite off on this problem 1 reef at a time, 2 reefs at a time, 3 reefs at a time, right? Start really demonstrating amazing success at those locations, and then move to the next set of locations and the next set of locations after that. I think that there is a real opportunity to marry those two things together and have restoration become a core part of many of these communities, many of these economies, many of the local workforces, and moving from there.
I think this is a really great overview of the fact that there are some hope stories out there, that to continue this work at scale, we're working really hard to find some standardized practices, standardized guidelines, destinations that we all have in common and where we would like to go. But I really like, Tom, your phrase of, you just got to start. And this is what we hope to do here at Iberostar, guided by all of the advice of you guys, but also something that we hope the tourism sector sees generally, that there's a lot of guidance out there of where it is that we need to go with these initiatives. And we're looking forward to helping to spur that energy and that work at the destination level. Thank you guys all so much for a great conversation.